Grace and peace to you from God our Father and from the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. It was an intense moment. The moment that Joseph looked down into the man's eyes. No, it wasn't Joseph in the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat Joseph. This was a different Joseph. A gentleman that I had the privilege to get to know and as part of a group of Christian leaders hear from. It was a few years ago. This Joseph, I believe, still is a police officer in Washington, D.C. And the day that he was telling us about was a powerful day in his life when he was just out doing his normal police work. He was walking the streets of Washington, D.C. when he met a homeless gentleman. And looking down into the man's eyes, I believe he said that the man was at the top of an escalator that was heading down to the subway system, and he was struggling that day. Joseph, looking down into this man's eyes, knew that he had been placed there for a significant moment, that he was the right person to be talking to this man, to love him, to give him encouragement, to talk to him about his circumstances. Joseph even told us that he offered to help start the process of making a change because he didn't want this man to be in his situation, and he thought he could help. And in response for trying to love this person, what Joseph got in return was a scathing rebuke from this gentleman who looked at him and said, "You know what, you're just a big, powerful police officer, and you're rich, and you've got a home to go back to. You've got no worries. What do you know about me? What do you know about my life? How do you dare try to give me encouragement and tell me anything about my experience?" In that moment, Joseph said he calmly looked down into the man's eyes and began to tell him his story. The story of why he was actually the right person to be speaking to him that day. And as he told us, this group of Christian leaders, this powerful story, he made sure we didn't miss it. The reason that he was able to talk to that gentleman had to do with the promise that had been woven into his life from his childhood, and it was there present that day, right by that escalator down to the subway in Washington, D.C. It was a promise. It was a promise that drove everything that he did. It's a big story that Joseph told us, and it's a powerful finish, and I'm going to tell you that finish in just a little bit, but that promise that Joseph told us about is also a promise that was woven into the life of another Joseph, the main character of chapter 3 of the story. The chapter that you're about to set out to read this week. It's the story we just heard about that began in Genesis chapter 37. And that story opens with a young man named Joseph, 17 years old, and he has been given a powerful platform. He is daddy's favorite. And to prove it, he's got a multicolored coat. Now, some of you are seeing Donny Osmond. That's okay. He wasn't in the Bible, but he did act it out on the stage. He had a multicolored coat. It was a sign of his father's affection. Joseph was the great-grandson of Abraham. He's pretty important. And Joseph knows that he's special in his family, at least his daddy's eyes, not his family. Joseph had a powerful platform as well because he had a special gift. He could dream. And you heard the dream, right? At 17 years old, dreaming about his brothers bowing down to him and what that did to his brothers, sibling rivalry, may be an understatement at this point. But it was from that powerful platform that Jacob, his dad, sent him out into the fields to go and find his brothers, to see how everything was going, raising the sheep, the flocks, whatever the animals were. And so in that powerful platform, Joseph went. And that's where the story begins. It's the place where he also finds out that your story can go from platform to pit in an instant. You see, when he arrives, those brothers in their loathsome jealousy grab Joseph and they discard him. They throw him down from his platform into a pit and they discard him as a worthless slave. They sell him to some traders, Ishmaelites of all people, who take him to the land of Egypt. What a painful rejection by the people who should have loved him. Can you imagine the pain of that rejection for Joseph? Some of you can. Because you know what rejection is in your life, don't you? You've been rejected as the black sheep of your family. And they think the title's deserved, but it crushes you. And you wonder when that title may be taken away from you. What was the rejection you experienced at the hands of the friends who always had your back, and then something changed and you're not sure what, but they won't give you the time of day anymore? What rejection has caused you to feel abandoned and worthless in your life? Was it a job promotion you were passed over for? Was it a promise that someone made to you that's still sitting on the table and it's broken to pieces? Was it a loan that you thought was going to come through and it was going to change everything for you and your family, but it was rejected? A plan you watched fall through? A relationship that broke into rejection? And some of you here know that feeling intimately. And I want you to know that Jesus knows that as well. He knows your rejection. And he knows himself what it is to be rejected. It's part of his story to be on that roller coaster of rejection. I mean, he's the one who said in our gospel reading, love your enemies and bless those who hate you. He's also the one who was discarded by his enemies and his closest friends as a worthless slave, nailed to a cross, rejected even by his Father for you. And yet through it all, Jesus, even in his crucifixion, held on to a promise. It was an anchor for him, and the promise was this: the Lord was with him. And you know what? In Genesis, as you read the story this week, you're going to see something come through loud and clear. In the middle of this first opening salvo of the roller coaster for Joseph, when he's sold into slavery and he's finally there in Egypt, you're going to see this phrase pop into what looks like an absolute pit for Joseph. And the Lord was with Joseph. And I want to tell you, friends, in Jesus, the Lord's with you. Would you repeat after me? The Lord is with me. Hang on to that. It's a promise for you. See, from platform to pit is where Joseph went. But then his story returns back to platform. It's an amazing thing. When he's sold into slavery, he ends up in the service of a man named Potiphar in Egypt. You're going to read all about this incident, and it is wild, I can tell you that. The one rejected by his family, by his brothers, now finds himself in the service of the captain of the king's guard, the captain of Pharaoh's soldiers. And the story tells us that Joseph finds favor in the eyes of Potiphar. And he rises to become chief of staff over all of Potiphar's house. This is pretty good. So with Joseph in charge, you're going to read this as well. Potiphar had no care at all, no worry about his household. Well, I've got to tell you, he should have been worried, not about Joseph, but about Potiphar's wife, because that's where the story takes a complete left turn. Because Joseph, it says, is a handsome man, and Potiphar's wife has the hots for him. And she goes so far as to repeatedly say to him, come and sleep with me. And Joseph in his righteousness says, I cannot offend Potiphar, my master, and I cannot sin against God. And in his righteousness, he trusts that the Lord is with him. And then that day, that fateful day, when he rejects her, just open advance on him one more time, but this time when he flees in righteousness, he forgets that he's left his cloak behind, and now she's there, having grabbed his cloak, and she's also grabbing onto an accusation, and she levels it. She's got a grudge, actually, and she tells Potiphar, her husband, that Joseph tried to take advantage of her. And in an instant, Joseph goes from platform, the chief of staff over Potiphar's house, to a pit again, except this time, in his rage, it's no cistern. It's a dungeon. That's where Potiphar sends Joseph, to the dungeon where all of the worst of the criminals, the state criminals in Pharaoh's land are sent, and it's in this place that he ends up languishing, as she twists everything around and accuses Joseph of misconduct. From platform to pit. This is incredible, isn't it? He's now locked in a dungeon, imprisoned as a state criminal, and for probably 10 years or more, he languishes there, locked away below the ground. All we know is he was released at 30 years of age. Can you imagine that? So I wonder what your mistake was, the one that got you blacklisted. and it still follows you? What words were rumored about you that are now true in everyone else's eyes? And you started to believe those rumors about yourself too. And they keep you locked in a prison. What hurtful words have you spoken that weren't just admitted into the court of your relationship, but they're part of historical record now, so every time you're with that person, they get brought back and you can't escape them, and you're locked in those words whether you like it or not. I mean, some of you know what it is to be found guilty as accused. That's what happened to Joseph. It turns out people are actually guilty as accused in others' eyes. And a few of you are still trying to defend yourself because you know you did nothing wrong, but you still can't open that door. It's locked tight. And a lot of us know the hurtful things we've done or said that got us placed there, but we're not sure how we could ever step back into that relationship because that person threw the key out the window. It seems like there's no hope of that prison door opening. So we all know those moments where we found ourselves locked in a either literal or figurative prison, guilty as accused. We know those. And it turns out Jesus knows those as well. He knows what it is to be found guilty as accused, of being possessed by demons, of talking to the wrong people, of saying the wrong things, of even trying to subvert the Roman Empire. And even though Pontius Pilate, the one you confessed in the Apostles' Creed, was part of Jesus' story, even Pontius Pilate could find no charge to be true against Jesus, it doesn't change the reality that Jesus was delivered over to Pilate as a state criminal. He was tried as a state criminal, and he was sentenced to death as a state criminal. The one who knew no sin became sin for you and for me. That's the message of Scripture. So he could bear your sin in his body on the cross, where he hangs and clings to a promise, the only promise that can satisfy him, that the Lord was with him. It was the promise. He trusted him. And the writer of Genesis, with Joseph in prison, continues to bring, like a march through his story, that same promise that Jesus clung to, as he tells us in the middle of Joseph's roller coaster, the Lord was with Joseph, even in the dungeon of Pharaoh. And I got to tell you, in Jesus, friends, the Lord is with you. So repeat after me. The Lord is with me. Hang on to that, especially when you find yourself locked away. My goodness, Joseph's story isn't done yet. And it turns out when the Lord is with you, your story's never done. See, he's put in charge of all those who are held in prison. That's the way that the story goes. He's made responsible for everything done there. He finds favor in the eyes of the prison warden as he had found favor in the eyes of Potiphar before. He finds himself interpreting some dreams one day. And one of those gentlemen whose dream he interpreted, who gets out of prison, Joseph asks to remember him, and then he forgets Joseph, and he languishes for 2 more years in prison, until this moment when he moves from pit to platform in one head-spinning scene because somebody had insomnia. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who had 2 dreams. And it turns out that Joseph interpreted them correctly and favorably. He warned the king that there were 7 years coming with a great harvest ahead, and then there were going to be 7 years of devastating famine. So Pharaoh, of all things, the head of Egypt, the king of Egypt, lifts Joseph up out of the dungeon and places him on a platform as number 2 over all of Egypt, charged with preparing the nation to weather this devastating disaster to come. I mean, you can't write this stuff, can you? It's all over the place. And get this, after 13 years after being discarded as a worthless slave by his brothers, Joseph has been sculpted and shaped by Yahweh, by the Lord, to save a nation. It is incredible. But the biggest twist, friends, and you're going to read about it, it is still to come. 9 years later, as Joseph goes down into one more pit, and it's not his own. See, it turns out this pit belongs to his family, who are starving and in need of food. They're feeling the effects of the famine as well, back in the land of Canaan. And it's Jacob's father who thinks, his father, who thinks that Joseph's dead, who sends his brothers to Egypt to buy food, and that's when it happens. You got to hear that part of the story today in our reading. See, bowing down before him, fulfilling the dream Joseph had at 17 years old. Just like he had dreamed, Joseph gets down into the pit with his family, and in that moment, he's got all the power. He could exact revenge. He could reject them outright. He could throw them into the dungeon as the king's prisoners. What would you do if you were Joseph in the midst of this story? What would you do? I'm excited for you to read chapter 3 and to feel the drama and the emotion, because here's how it ends. In the end, staring at the ones who had sold him into slavery and started this whole crazy saga, Joseph remembers what the writer of Genesis has made plain for you and for me today. He remembers this promise. The Lord was what? With Joseph. Can you imagine that moment when Joseph looks down at his brothers and says, "Come close to me." And when they had, he said, "I'm your brother, the one you sold into Egypt. And now don't be distressed, don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there have been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 there'll be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save lives by great deliverance." I love this. May we hold on to this. "So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler over all Egypt." Incredible, isn't it? I mean, how do you survive an ordeal like Joseph survived? How do you withstand the roller coaster of emotions and keep your sanity? How could Joseph say these things with such confidence? Well, it turns out when you have a promise, that promise will drive everything in your life. And the promise is this: the Lord was with Joseph in the moments where he could feel Yahweh's presence tangibly with him, where he could celebrate it, and he knew that he had found favor because the Lord was with him. And that promise held true for Joseph even in the moments when he felt lost and completely abandoned by Yahweh. And it was in those moments where the promise held on to Joseph. Let me say that again. In those moments, and maybe this is where you're today, feeling rejected, feeling like you're locked in a prison, the promise held on to Joseph, and it was the only thing that brought him through. And as a result, God saved a nation. How much more astounding is it that as Jesus hangs on the cross, clinging to his Father's promise, he cries out, my God, in that painful discourse, "Why have you forsaken me?" And even the Son of God in that moment can do nothing else except be held in the promise that his Father would never in the end abandon him to the pit of the grave. And because Jesus received the fulfillment of that promise, because Jesus is risen from the dead never to die again, then the promise that Yahweh was with Joseph becomes the promise for you, that the Lord is with you and he will hold you all the way to eternity. That promise now seals for you the promise of a day that's coming when every platform is brought low and every pit filled up and you're lifted high. The Lord is with you, and that promise follows you to the very end of the age. And significantly, that promise is also holding you right now. Whatever you're experiencing right now, absolutely, that promise is for you. And I want to tell you, it held that man named Joseph, not the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat Joseph, but that Washington, D.C. police officer as he stared into the eyes of that homeless man who was yelling at him. "How could you understand my situation? You're big, you're powerful, you've got money, you're rich, you've got a house to go back to, so don't tell me about my experience. You don't understand." And as Joseph related his story to us, he told us why he figured he was exactly the right person to be speaking to that man that day, as he began to tell that man and us the story about how when he was a child, he had watched his mother be dragged away by soldiers during the Civil War in his birth country of Liberia, West Africa, about how to survive, he had to work in the rice fields, planting and harvesting rice. And when he would come out, most days of the water, he would have leeches all over his legs, and he'd have to have someone take a pair of pliers and pull them off. and it would tear his skin, and he got horrible sores, and he still had the scars. And it got so bad, the rejection that he faced, he and his brother ended up fleeing to the United States. That's where his father was. But through another roller coaster of events, Joseph ended up homeless, of all people, in the streets of D.C. And then something changed his life. And he became a police officer with a mission: to love and to bless the people he encountered who had been in a situation like his, because he didn't want them languishing on the streets in fear. So he figured he was the right person for that moment, after everything that Jesus had sculpted him to experience and had given him as a platform that day, as he gave love and encouragement to that man who could never have guessed Joseph's story. And as he relayed that story to us, he wanted us, beyond a shadow of a doubt, to know that it was because of one thing that he could stand there that day. It was because, as he told us, friends, the Lord was with me. The Lord was with Joseph right there on the streets of Washington, D.C., through his unique story, shaping that moment for him to be a blessing, the blessing that that man in front of him could have never guessed. And he said, I don't know what happened to the man. I never saw him again. He may have changed his life. He may have died. But I know he met Jesus because I met Jesus in him that day. It's an incredible story when you think about how Joseph's story was shaped, both Joseph's, through all the twists and turns and the ups and downs, to be exactly the right blessing for that person in that time. Friends, the Lord is with you, most assuredly. That promise is holding on to you as he shapes your story, whatever you're going through today, in the deepest rejection, in the darkest prison, or at the highest of your joy. The Lord is with you, shaping you as he weaves his grand upper story into your unique story. And he'll use your story this week in ways that you're never going to be able to expect. That is exciting, to serve and to bless and to change someone's life, whose story he'll weave into yours. So as you think about what that could mean for you this week, would you repeat after me one more time? The Lord is with me. Now say it again. The Lord is with me. One more time. The Lord is with me. Hang on to that. It's a promise that you have been given today without a shadow of a doubt, to hold you in the highest of heights to the deepest of pits. When your life feels like a roller coaster, in Jesus, you have the assurance that his presence will follow you all the way to eternity, but even more than that he has shaped you and given you a unique platform because of everything you have gone through, to be his response of love in the life of whoever he puts before you this week. So St. Luke, the Lord is with us. So let's go and read chapter 3 of the story and bless our world. Amen.